So, Malcolm, you are a pastor
Yes, sir.
in what country?
The United States of America.
Yeah, but that other one, the one that thinks it's a
Oh,
country.
Texas.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah,
Texas.
yeah.
Tell us about your work there and your church as well.
Yeah, so I co-pastor an intentionally multicultural church in Waco, Texas. It's called Mosaic. We planted the church back in 2019, so right before the pandemic. Just a
Wow.
great time to plant a church. But and I also serve at Baylor as special advisor to Baylor's president for equity and campus engagement. So I'm bivocational.
Cool.
But yeah.
And it is like Chip and Joanna Gaines are hanging out in that
Yeah,
area.
I mean they're around. I
You
haven't
been to them?
met them yet.
No.
I haven't met them yet.
Okay.
But the day is coming. The day is
I'm
coming.
gonna ask you a personal question. It's okay
Of
if you don't
course.
want to answer. Do you have shiplap in your house?
I do. I
Okay.
didn't choose it. I mean, I could just it when we got
There's
the
no
house,
shame.
it was there, and
You
I
don't need to
just
be ashamed of it. You know, I also have a smattering of shiplap in the house, so it's okay. We're among friends here.
okay, good.
So you are pastor in an intentionally multi-ethnic church in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
which I can imagine has a lot of opportunities to grow in the grace of the Lord
Mm-hmm.
in the year of our Lord 2024. Moreover, Malcolm, you wrote a book called The Anti-Greed Gospel: Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How the Church Can Create a New Way Forward.
Yes, sir.
So, are you trying to close your church or
Yeah. See, the great thing about planning a church is that from day one you can set the culture of it. So then,
Oh, okay.
when a book like this comes out, they're like, "Oh yeah, he's been preaching about greed for now a few years. I guess this kind of makes sense."
Okay, that's good. So for any potential church planners out there, if you want to write a spicy book,
You got to prep them early.
you got to start early. Yeah, don't bury the lead. So tell us about the book, why you wrote the book, and what
Yeah.
you're hoping to do with it.
So I mean, Brazos approached me about this book back in 2020, and they just wanted kind of a book on racial violence and the church because I'd finished my Well, I was writing my dissertation, which I wrote on Black Protestants responding to lynching in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I was thinking about what is it that the church needs to know about particularly that period, about what is the darkest period of African American history, and I say that with full knowledge of the years of slavery, and over the course of that next like 2 years, so actually 2020 to 2022, this was developing, and there was a book that I thought I wanted to write on racial violence in the church back in 2020, and then I went through some kind of personal developments, and one of the things that was deeply impressed on me was that the conversation about race is not fundamentally a conversation about identity. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
conversation about hate, and it's not a conversation about ignorance. What it is it's a conversation about greed. That if we want to deal with racism, we've got to deal with its material roots, and historically those material roots, the primary material root is greed. It's that race is fundamentally a a justification of modes of economic exploitation. And so if that's true, and I believe it is, then one of the primary ways that we resist it is by building communities that resist that exploitation.
So you've got this great bit in the book, and I've also watched you deliver in sermonic form this material as well. And I'm not going to do it justice, but it's something like the Portuguese did not bother
Yeah,
themselves to get on boats, cross over the Mediterranean, go find a bunch of people, enslave them because they were racist.
right. Yeah,
They
yeah,
did so because of money.
yeah.
And that's a really powerful kind of like one liner of like, well, of course, hatred for someone else doesn't compel you to get on the boat and go across, but like money does.
Yeah.
And that just seeing throughout even America's history of like, why are these things happening? What's the power behind all this? And your argument throughout the book is it's mammon. Could you spend just like, for those of us unfamiliar with the word mammon, or maybe we remember some preacher saying it a few, sermons ago, what's mammon?
Yeah. And here's what's I think important about the Portugal line. So basically I say that, the Portuguese didn't enslave Africans because they were racist. They did it because they had markets to expand. And as you said, you've got to think about what is it that actually motivates you to cross those seas. And and I have this line in the book. I think the most significant anti-racist text in Scripture is Matthew 6:24, when Christ says, "You cannot serve two masters. You will either love one and hate the other, or you'll despise one and be loyal to the other. You cannot serve both God and Mammon." Is translated riches in some Bibles, money in others. And Mammon is just it's an Aramaic word just for riches. And what I have, one of the things that kind of developed over the course of the years of thinking about the book and then the year of writing it was that every Christian is embroiled in a cosmic battle. And that cosmic battle has not changed since Jesus said those words.
Yeah.
When he said you can't serve two masters, he could have chosen any of the numerous idols that we face. Could have said can't serve God and self, or God and political power, whatever.
Right.
And what he chose was money. And like that we haven't changed, and we haven't defeated money. Mm-hmm. and so we still remain locked in what is a cosmic battle for our souls, and that battle is between God and Mammon. And so when I look at particularly the history of race, what I see is an instantiation of that cosmic battle. Mm-hmm. And so then when those are the categories, when the categories of the war change, then the way that we think about our weapons of war also has to change. And so simply Mammon is money or riches, and the pursuit of Mammon is what we call greed. The worship of Mammon is greed. Allowing money and riches to kind of dictate our day-to-day actions and things like that. That is Mammon worship. And it is, I think, the most pernicious form of idolatry that we actually deal with.
Yeah. Recognizing the consistent seductive power of Mammon. Jesus saw this. We see it today. Here we are in America, where I'm an American. I'm a super nerd about my family tree. So I know when about, a couple dozen of my ancestors came over from, most of them Western Europe, and 1600s, 1700s. It does seem like what drew a lot of them here was financial advancement,
Yeah.
And it does seem like in the water that I am swimming in is signifiers of Mammon worship that may be or may feel innocuous to me. So, for instance, I know that I have been referred to by my leaders as the American consumer dozens of times when I'm listening to the radio or I'm watching TV, whatever. And it's like the American consumer. I'm like, that's me.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah.
I am. Right? That's identity formation. I'm a consumer.
Yeah.
We're recording this a week after America's number one holiday, Black Friday. And its subsequent holidays like Cyber Saturday and something Monday. Anyways.
Yeah. Cyber Monday, and I don't know what the Saturday is.
I think it just like
they'll take the week.
We will take your money weekend. Yeah. It's like Holy Week for Mammon.
It is, to a certain extent. Yeah.
what are some other markers as we look at our lives today that might be pointing to mammon worship that maybe we're blinded to, or we just think are innocuous, or like these are just normal things?
Yeah. So one of the points I want to make in the beginning of the book is specifically define the political economy in which we live, and by political economy, what I'm referring to is not just kind of the way that we exchange goods and the way that we kind of portion out power, but also the ways that shapes that's a cultural project. So I think it's really important that when we, especially evangelicals, love to use the language of the culture,
Yeah,
the culture.
yeah.
And for me, like, economy is the most important element of the culture.
Okay.
And it's the one that goes remarkably under theorized, especially in church
Hmm.
context. And so in the book, I argue that our particular form of capitalism is marked by three things: neoliberalism, racialization, and and financial and financialization. So by neoliberal, what I mean is that it is the cultural project of shaping us into competitive individuals. That fundamentally who we are, we're in competition with one another for a scarce amount of goods, and we're individually responsible, and and individually seeking. So paired with that is also the idea that if you suffer, it's probably your fault, and you just need to work harder, because we're in a society of opportunity and wealth, and if you're not taking part of it, it's probably your fault. That's one
So
element.
real quick,
Oh, go
so
ahead.
like Marlboro Man, like the cowboy by himself on the horse,
Yeah.
homesteading, the self-made man movies that we have, the rags to riches. It's my own personal ambition and my own personal drive that's on me, and I'm competing
Yep.
with others to excel in life. So we're making movies about this all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
And ideally the role of the government is not just to, like, kind of not just to get out of the way of the desires of profit, but actually to actively cultivate those roads of profit. It's one element. The racialization element. All the history of capitalism and the history of race are essentially happening at the same time, because in order for this system to keep going, it also requires us to categorize one another, to put one another in categories, where people become less than people. They become exploitable. They become exploitable things. And then lastly, the financialization point. When we look at our global economy, the derivatives market, that is people betting on the values of goods, that market is bigger than the actual, like, no, like, than the actual value of goods in the world. What that indicates is that you can just make a lot of money betting on money.
Wow.
And it's ridiculous. But what it does is it continues to abstracts money from our thoughts. So we don't think about the fact that a lot of the money that we're making is actually it is actually being extracted from people.
Hmm.
As our systems get more and more complicated, we get we it essentially exploitation just gets more and more complicated and more invisible.
Okay.
And it's actually, we feel like it's in our best interest to keep that invisible, because the less we think about it, the less I have to feel guilty about it. So let's
So,
keep that off the side.
so thinking about like my day to day life,
Yeah.
I've got like a 40. Well, I'm a minister, so I have a 403b, but it's like a retirement account, 401k, and numbers go up and down on this piece of paper I get. I want the numbers to go up, for my retirement or whatever.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding you right, what you're saying is underneath all those numbers, there's a potential for exploitation to be happening. That wealth is being extracted from people somehow,
Yeah.
and I don't want to see it.
No. Well, and and here's this is a little bonus thing. So usury, according to the scriptures, is the charging of interest, and it is universally panned in the scriptures. It's something you're not supposed to do. Jesus says even explicitly that like when you give to people, don't charge interest. And he'll also say in the Sermon on the Mount, look, if anybody asks you, give it to them. We have an entire political economy that is rooted in interest. It's not until really the 16th century when and I believe it's Queen Elizabeth starts setting limits on interest, and she just sets a limit at 10%. They're like 10% is egregious. Anything above 10% is egregious. Up until that point, any interest was egregious, and so they just picked a random number, and then like this is what usury is now.
Yeah, right.
But like it's something that we can't, like you can't really run from it. The entire world now runs on it.
Yeah.
And for many, like that's just seen as an unproblematic thing. It's just kind of the way that things are. I want to draw attention to the fact that it's like actually no, like this actually does cause pain.
Yeah. So one of the, I think, effects of this commitment to the pursuit of growing wealth, pursuit of mammon, is treating people like possessions. In America's history, in many histories around the world, slavery, treating a person as if they're a machine or some kind of just a thing to produce wealth, not an actual human made in the image and likeness of God. In America's history, I mean, it's just in the DNA. It's in the foundation, so to speak. It's all over the place. A lot of our wealth, you do such a great job in your book chronicling, kind of giving us a survey of like a lot of the wealth that was built up in the Americas was built by slave labor. So like just our initial like starting point, that initial amount of money and wealth that eventually, grew and grew and grew to where industrialization happens and so on. But you do a lot of work really focusing on the Jim Crow era, specifically around lynching. Why that focus?
Yeah. And this is what I expect when people encounter this in the book. I expect it to be a little bit of a surprise. So people are like, wait, what? Where'd this come from?
Right.
And for me, it's because, first of all, this is not a period of history that people talk a lot about.
Okay.
Second of all, when people do talk about it, they talk about it as though, well, it's just these crazy racist white people who gather in mobs and kill people. And it's just like, and it's horrible and it's racist and it's bad. And then like, that's the extent of the theorizing that we do publicly about it. Glad we don't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I want to remind people of is actually, this is actually just a particular instantiation of a logic. So I frame in the beginning that race is part of what I call a demonic cycle of self-interest that begins in the desire to exploit and dominate one another. And because people don't like to be exploited and dominated, we have to employ violence to keep them in that position. So you got exploitation, violence, and then because we because unless we're psychopaths or sociopaths, we have consciences. And so because of that, we don't like to think about ourselves as waking up in the morning and thinking, hey, what a great day of exploiting, dominating, and killing my neighbor. Right. So we create narratives in order to tell ourselves that that's not what we're doing to each other. And this is the role that race plays. Race gives me the language to say, well, no, these people are in this position because they're supposed to be, because they're naturally, this is just part of who they are, as opposed to part of what I or others have done to them because of these categories that they've created. And so this cycle of exploitation, violence, and justification kind of keeps going. It's obvious in something like racialized chattel slavery. I think it's also present in lynching too. So it begins because of greed. and it ends because of greed. It doesn't fade just because people are like, oh no, like it's not a moral revolution where people realize, oh no, we shouldn't be doing this to other human beings.
Mm-hmm.
No, it becomes bad for business. It becomes an embarrassment to the United States. And so there are other. So then they find other ways to suppress and exploit, particularly Black communities, because that's something that's happened kind of throughout American history. So that's one of the things that's going on there. I want this to be a history that people, where people look into the abyss, because it is
Mm-hmm.
it is very, very dark.
Yeah.
But I want us to remember. I want us to remember where the logic of Mammon worship leads, and it always leads to death.
Hmm. Yeah. One of your refrains in the book is Mammon demands blood sacrifice.
Yeah.
So thinking about America's history, how greed has been woven throughout that, you also have a personal history that you share about in the book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so particularly the lynching,
Yeah.
the
Mm-hmm.
lynching history.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my great great grandfather, um so something happened. It was one of two things. It was either he was at a store and didn't respond to a white store clerk when she was talking to him, or he was in a fight with a guy and he fought back. And the thing about both of those things is that they are both lynchable offenses in the early 20th century.
Hmm.
And so my family was in Issaquah County, Mississippi. They fled Issaquah County, Mississippi to East St. Louis, because a mob was after them. And this is the story of many, many, many Afro-American folks in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's one of the things that drives the Great Migration, where 6 million folks move from the South into the North. They do so not only for economic opportunity, but to flee racial violence. Um, it's true of my family, and it's true of many, many, many others. What's sad about that, though, is also that, like, the violence doesn't stop because they leave. In many ways, the violence follows them. So it's during that period that you also see the quote unquote race riots of the early 20th century, particularly in the cities where Afro Americans are migrating to, because they become new labor competition, and there are and folks get their houses bombed. For example, you've got the example of Tulsa as the one that most people kind of first think about, but there are others around the country, where these efforts to build, especially economically self-sufficient Black communities, they folks get ran out of town, folks get threatened with, and they get threatened with violence, and they get violence visited upon them,
Mm-hmm.
for those reasons. But like I said, I mean, that's part of my personal history, but it's also part of the history of many.
Yeah. You do some work in the book too, showing how different leaders were trying to address the problem of lynching, and some chose paths of meeting violence with violence. Others chose paths of maybe what you call, peaceful protest or peaceful resistance. Others chose the path of recognizing the primary problem isn't racial prejudice, it's greed. So let's hit them in the pocketbook.
Hit them where it
Maybe
hurts.
give us a little summary of kind of those three different responses to the lynching in that Jim Crow era.
Yeah, so I focus on three individuals, two of whom I take a more critical eye to. And one of those guys is Francis Grimke, who's a Black Presbyterian pastor, who in 1899, following the lynching of Sam Hose in Noonan, Georgia, basically preaches a sermon series where he says, "Hey, education education is the way to stop lynching. So we need to engage in in social and moral education for folks so that people understand what lynching is, understand that it's bad, and then they'll stop. And then 7 years later, after the Atlanta race riots in 1906, he's like, yeah, actually, the only way to stop a mob is to shoot it to death or dynamite it. Basically, the only way to stop a lynch mob is for that lynch mob to fear for its life. And this is a position that I think a lot of people resisting lynching get to this point, because it's so frustrating to see this go on for so long that folks get to the point where they essentially lose hope. My argument is that they lose hope, and they lose an understanding of even the mob as a mob of people. And so I frame that, maybe controversially, I frame that as a moral failure. But I put that alongside another moral failure by a white Methodist minister, Atticus Haygood, who, when asked why these men were burned alive in 1892 in a few lynchings, his argument is essentially, well, you look at the crime that they're accused of, and the mob just kind of went crazy. And if I was part of the mob, I probably would have gone crazy too. And if they just don't commit these crimes, then everything will be fine. And he's emblematic of what I think is, people know, when people think about racism, they generally tend to think about things like the Klan. And one of the things I want to press with this second response is paternalism is just as dangerous, and leads to the same results. But thirdly, I deal with Ida B. Wells, who is she's a hero, just a hero of mine, ought to be a hero of all of us. But in her national and international anti-lynching campaigns, she lays out all of the false narratives that undergird not only all the false narratives that undergird lynching, but she also hits basically all of the major forms of resistance to lynching too, just in her words. And one of her lines is that the white man's dollar is his god, and appeals to his pocket have ever been more effective than appeals to his conscience. And it plays out in the way that she frames resistance to lynching. So when she encourages emigration so that people leave the communities where lynchings take place, one of the things that she's saying is like, look, don't give them the opportunity to exploit you. Leave. That'll cut the that'll cut the fuel out from under the fire. Also, and she'll also advocate for self-defense. She'll advocate for particular forms of political action. She'll advocate for educating folks through pulpit and press. I mean, she wants to hit it from every single angle, and she does so brilliantly over the course of decades. And she doesn't get the shine that she deserves. But I hope to give her a little bit of it here.
So today we're seeing conversations about things like immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there is dehumanizing rhetoric that's leveraged by some.
Yeah.
Underneath that, though, is this: they're going to take our jobs.
Yep.
Bit, right? They're going to take the money.
Yep.
There's conversations around America reckoning with its history of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, even perhaps more recently, not giving Black soldiers their benefits from the GI Bill.
Mm-hmm.
Still in living memory. And sometimes explicit, oftentimes implicit in those conversations is a resistance that comes from, wait a minute, who's going to pay for this?
Mm-hmm.
Right and wrong is not really what we're talking about. We're talking about money. Like the word reparations.
Yep.
Yeah, especially in conversations about racism, chattel slavery in particular. It ignites the passions in some, what I hear you arguing for is the passions are not ignited because you're talking about making things right. It's because it's going to hit them in the pocketbook. It's the money. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security conversations right now. You and I are hearing this from our federal leaders and those who will be the leaders after the inauguration in January. Conversations about government oversight and regulations. Usually underneath that is, this is impacting business.
Mm-hmm.
So it does seem to be not just something that was going on with the Portuguese in the 15th century or America in the 19th century. It seems like it might be impacting me today. And it's all over the place, is what I'm hearing.
Sure is.
Yeah. Okay. Thinking about moving forward, one of the things that we're hearing is that the answer to our problems, the way that we get back to godliness, is to use imperial power. Right? The problem with, some would argue, you're right, greed's a problem, Malcolm. We do want a place where everyone's treated righteously. And the way to do that is for Christians to rally themselves together and to take government power so that we can protect and propagate a Christian way of being in the world. And that's going to lead to peace, equity, justice for all, whatever. Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't buy it. But
I felt like I sold it pretty well.
But not just
in my tone. I wasn't yelling.
But not just because I don't buy it, but it's because of the way that I think about the kingdom of God. So, so one of the things that I press in the book is that I think that a proper Christian political theology understands that essentially God has established the church as kind of this first line of defense in this battle against the powers and principalities, which is to say that God has called his people to operate in a way that is contrary to the logic of the kingdoms of the world. And so what I press in the second half of the book are these three ways of us organizing ourselves that resist particularly this demonic cycle of self-interest. And so against the exploitation in the cycle, we're supposed to build communities of deep economic solidarity. The economic witness of the church is actually one of its most significant witnesses. In Acts 2, after the Holy Spirit descends on his people, they commit themselves to four things: devotion to the apostles' teaching, prayer, the breaking of bread, and the fellowship. And the fellowship, that is the sharing of goods, is their economic witness. Their economic witness is that the Holy Spirit is building communities without need. Yep. Like that's how God's grace is described in Acts 4. That God's grace was so powerfully at work among them that there were no needy people in their midst. And it's not because they kept the needy out. It's because when the needy came in, they gained the resources of the entire community, and then didn't have any need anymore. When the needy came into the midst of the people of God gathered to meet their need. And that's I think integral to the way that Christian communities ought to function. That's just one point. Contra the violence, we're supposed to be communities of creative anti-violence, and I draw that pretty comprehensively, because for me the opposite of violence is love, and love is the primary thing that Christ has called us to do to one another, including our enemies. And the way that I frame that, I define love coming from John, coming from James, but also coming from Jesus, that love is a material investment in your neighbor, and not just your neighbor. It also includes your enemy. I think about Romans 12 when Paul quotes the scripture saying that if your enemy is hungry, you give him food. If your enemy's thirsty, you give him something to drink. That's not the way that nations function. But it is the way that the church, but it is the way that we as Christians ought to function. But then lastly, contra the lies of race and racism, we have to be communities of prophetic truth telling, that we not only tell the truth kind of about ourselves, among ourselves, but also that we but also that we remain rooted in the truths about the world. And so when we are told that that just profit maximization is the way to success and things like that, we have to be aware of the ways in which that's actually dangerous. And so for example, in a political economy that baptizes the desire to get rich, where it's just like, hey, like everybody can and everybody should desire that, we have to come back with 1 Timothy 6, where we're told that not only is the love of money the root of all kinds of evil, but like those who desire to get rich fall into a trap and a snare. And that's really hard. It's really hard to say that like even the desire to get rich is something that the Lord is trying to excise out of us. But he is, because even that very desire gets us into trouble. So to the political power point, I'm like, don't expect the kingdoms of the world to be able to operate by that logic. Now, any political power that we have, yes, please use it so that oppression ceases and exploitation slows. But understand that like you're up against powers and principalities, and you don't want to, so even any victories that you might win are always going to be like proximate and temporary.
Yes.
And temporary victories.
Yes.
But among the people of God, we have an opportunity to actually comprehensively live by that logic and show people that there's another way to live. Because people are only going to know that alternatives exist, not if we just talk about it, but if we actually build communities that actually look like that.
Yeah. Embassies in which we invite people to look at a different kingdom on their own turf.
Yep.
Yeah. You say in your book, I'm going to read your own words back to you. In this sense, both the Christian nationalist and the progressive Christian bent on political power are wrong. Both sides argue that the journey to salvation includes a road to political power, although the former has done so with more explicit violence. We are told that if we just get more Christians into positions of political power, the world will change, but that logic remains coercive.
Mm-hmm.
The change that we would be initiating in those spaces would be forced. For both sides, victory looks like domination rather than invitation, no matter how apparently benign that domination is. That's a good word. That's a good word. And it's a good caution for us because we're hearing so many leaders, especially as in evangelical spaces in America, there are so many saying, we want righteousness, we want justice, we want godliness, we want God to bless our land. We got to take power.
Yep.
And it does seem to me, and I think you're arguing this as well, that desire to take power is in and of itself a corrupting influence.
Yep.
So the means by which we go about doing a thing dramatically impact the ends.
Yep. Absolutely.
Go.
Well, this is what, and this is, I think, one of the things that's most compelling about the way that Martin Luther King frames nonviolence, because one of the things that lies at the heart of that thinking is that means have to match the ends.
Yeah.
And so because otherwise violence begets violence, domination begets domination.
Yes. And
this is and I think of the way that Jesus approached James and John when they were like, "Hey, we want to sit at your right and left hand." He's like, "That's not the way this is not the way power. It's not the way power works. Like, I know you want to be in those spots because you want to be in charge and exalted above everyone. It's like, this is not the way power works."
Right.
And specifically Jesus, through his incarnation, life, death, and resurrection, exemplifies that particular fact.
Yeah.
Because the one who has all power chose not to use it in domination, but instead chose fundamentally to share it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the primary message of the incarnation that Christ took flesh in order to share everything that he has with us.
Mm-hmm.
Even, we're told at the end of Revelation, even his reign, such that the saints are going to reign alongside him, because he seeks to share everything that he has. And this is part of the broader point that I want to make about even what the economic witness of the Christian is that we are constantly told that we are meant to be either or both producers and consumers. And one of the fundamental messages of the gospel is that we are actually fundamentally sharers. That everything we have has been given to us by the Lord, and for the purpose of sharing. And so one of the things that is kind of hardest to beat down in us, but I think is most important, is that we emphasize that sharing ought to be kind of fundamental to our identity, because that's what Christ did for us.
Yeah.
His incarnation, life, death, and resurrection are fundamentally acts of sharing.
That's so good. Well, Malcolm, thank you for being with us today. Where can people find you and your work?
So I'm still on Twitter. We'll see how long that works. But also Instagram, at RevDocMalc. And then I'm also on Blue Sky. I'm on Blue Sky too. Malcolm B. Foley, and it's Malcolm B. Foley on Blue Sky, and also Twitter. But also, pick up the book. It's cheap. It's short. Like, I wrote this for you. And I wrote this for you to be able to pass out to your family too. So check it out.
Love it. Malcolm, thanks so much for being with us.
Of course. Thank you, Caleb.